Wireless devices of every shape, size, and function imaginable, notwithstanding the ever present mobile phone with over 3 billion users and counting. These devices transmit and receive a type of radio wave that our bodies do not recognize as safe. Exposure to these devices put our bodies in a state of constant stress. As the proliferation of these devices accelerate faster than anything mankind has seen, the question remains, is it all too much, too soon? Dr. George Carlo, founder of the Safe Wireless Initiative in Washington, D.C., shed some light on these questions and answers.
On the cell membrane, there are receptors. On every cell, there are receptors. And those receptors are there to monitor what happens in the environment around the cell. And it turns out there are two types of receptors. One type of receptor is a chemical receptor that picks up chemicals that are floating in the river between cells, the interstitial fluid, we call that. And there are also vibrational receptors. Those vibrational receptors are what we call ciliary receptors. And those vibrational receptors pick up electromagnetic radiation vibrations. So what happens is that when you have an information carrying radio wave that is oscillating in the hertz range, it is able to have an instantaneous resonance with a ciliary receptor. And when that happens, the cell recognizes that there is a wave in its environment. Up until that point, everything is fine. Mm-hmm. The difficulty is that these information-carrying radio waves are man-made. They don't exist anywhere in nature. Therefore, the cells have no historical memory of these information-carrying radio waves. There's no energy signature that they can recognize from these information-carrying radio waves. And when that happens, the cell interprets the information-carrying radio wave as a foreign invader. This happens within milliseconds, so that this recognition, this resonance occurs within milliseconds. The interpretation happens within a few seconds, and once the cell interprets the information-carrying radio wave as an invader, it stimulates this sympathetic response, and the cell membrane begins to close down.
In a moment, we will have more explorations in the mechanism of harm from information-carrying radio waves. First, let us consider what we can do to protect ourselves from these harmful waves. Certainly, we can minimize our use of cell phones and other Wi-Fi devices. Also, we can take a look at this website, www.safewireless.org. On this site, there are many recommendations to reduce and minimize the risk of exposure to wireless devices and transmitters. Now back to Dr. George Carlo.
Well, the other thing that happens is that waste products get trapped inside the cell. And those waste products inside the cell form free radicals, which are highly reactive molecules. And those free radicals will go any place where there is an unbound spot on a molecule, on an atom, wherever. And it so happens that in the cell, in the organelle called mitochondria, you have a great deal of activity, a great deal of energy, because the mitochondria is the organelle that provides the intracellular energy. Free radicals preferentially move to the mitochondria and disrupt mitochondrial function. And when free radicals bind to the mitochondria are not able to form efficiently the transfer from ADP to ATP. So that now you have the cell becoming more energy deficient. When a cell goes through apoptosis, the cell membrane disintegrates, and everything inside the cell is released into the interstitial space between cells. And that is a cleansing process normally. But where you have micronuclei that have been formed inside the cell, those micronuclei are released into the interstitial fluid where there are nutrients. It's a nutrient-rich interstitial fluid because remember, the nutrients could not get inside the cell. So now, these micronuclei are energized by the nutrients. They clone and they proliferate. And that is the mechanism that leads to the development of tumors.
In a moment, Dr. Carlo will resume his talk about information-carrying radio waves and the dramatic increase in several diseases. First, a word to health practitioners. Some researchers say there is a coming epidemic of electromagnetically induced or enhanced diseases. EMR University conducts workshops and seminars on this topic. This education is designed for health practitioners and government health department personnel. Please contact Dr. Carlo at safewireless.org for more information. Now back to Dr. George Carlo.
So as you can see, we have disruption of intercellular communication, we have triggering of apoptosis, and we have cellular dysfunction. All three distinct mechanisms that occur because the ciliary receptors on the cell membrane interpret the information-carrying radio waves as a foreign invader. We have just published recently a paper looking at heavy metal clearance in autistic patients. And what we found there was that after the electromagnetic radiation was removed from the treatment environment, that heavy metals began to clear. When you have a cell membrane that's closed down and you use chelating agents, you actually rip through the cell membrane with those metals. And when that happens, you cause further damage because now you have sympathetic stress happening in that cell membrane from the inside. As the child gets older and there are more cell turnovers, where you have the cell membrane becoming more in a sympathetic lock, that the chelation is causing more damage. That's why you can see that the metals are clearing, but that the symptoms are not subsiding. The fundamental pathology in Alzheimer's is very similar to the pathology that we have in autism and electrohypersensitivity. The mechanism with Alzheimer's is that the disruption of intercellular communication turns the lights off in sections of the brain. And when the lights are off, the body does not feed that section of the brain. You have the information-carrying radio waves accelerating the onset of symptoms in autism. And we think that it's exacerbating the pathology in Alzheimer's. And then in between, we have this new phenomenon that is relatively recent in terms of large numbers in the population of electrohypersensitivity. And what we believe is happening with electrohypersensitivity is that chronic exposure to information-carrying radio waves or acute exposure, some type of major zap from radar or something like that, can trigger this sympathetic lock. And when that happens, you have this same configuration of the cell membrane in the successive daughter cells, and the cell membrane's closed down. And what happens there is that the difference between a normal response to an electromagnetic field, which would mean that you would have a a normal cell membrane that's in a parasympathetic situation, and then it closes down into sympathetic, and then it would open back up. In electrohypersensitivity, the normal cell membrane is already closed down. And when you have an exposure to an information-carrying radio wave or an extremely low frequency, an electric field, a magnetic field, the membrane actually shuts all the way down. And that's why you have this very severe reaction. So that it's really a continuum type of condition where autism, electrohypersensitivity, Alzheimer's disease are really all different variations of the same pathology.
Thank you for listening to our first session of this important public health issue. Coming up in the series, we will explore some important questions governing the use of mobile phones. Early this year, the French government warned against the use of mobile phones, especially by children. Germany advises its people to minimize the use of headsets, and the European Environmental Agency has called for exposures to be reduced. Why is it that all these governments, including England, Australia, and Canada, have issued warnings against exposures to wireless phones, while the U.S. government has remained strangely silent? Could the answer be that the primary makers of this technology reside and pay taxes in the U.S.? Why is it that Lloyd's of London has refused to indemnify the cell phone industry? Why is there now more than 12 to 15 pages of disclaimer information in the user manual of each new cell phone? These and more questions will be explored in our next session. So until then, be safe.